Welcome to Generation Digital Workforce, the podcast that's here to explore the role of robotic process automation and other digital technologies. Whether you're just getting started or you're looking for advanced strategies and tactics, if you're curious about where human and digital workers are coming together to transform the future of work, then this podcast is for you. All right, let's get into the show.
Welcome to Generation Digital Workforce. I'm your host for today's episode, Lisa Hackbarth. I'm joined today by Khatina Brunson, Customer Success Manager at Blue Prism. Khatina, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you.
Great. I'm so excited for you to be here.
Absolutely.
All right. So it's great to have you on the show. Today, we're going to be talking about best practices for RPA process requirements. But before we begin, could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. I'd be happy to. So I actually have over 20 years of experience in IT. I started out my career as a Y2K programmer. And from there, I just went into various different paths with technology. So I've done everything from project management to solutions consulting, which is the most recent thing that I've done here before becoming a customer success manager with Blue Prism. But I do have over 15 years of experience writing requirements within the various roles that I've held, such as a business analyst and systems analyst. So that's why I'm really excited to be here today to talk about best practices.
Great. Yeah, it sounds like you have lots of wealth of experience. So it's great to have you here. All right, so let us dive in. So first, Khatina, why do we need to create requirements for automated processes?
The answer to that question is really twofold. So the first and most obvious reason is that you need to know what you're building. Requirements are basically a set of directions. So in case someone else is going to be configuring the automation, they need a blueprint. The second reason is that a requirements document can also act as a future reference. Sometimes there are questions that arise later about what a specific automated process is actually doing, and you have an opportunity to reference the requirements document to answer those questions.
Okay, great. That totally makes sense. All right, so let's say we have decided on a process we want to automate. What's the first thing we should do?
There are some preliminary steps we need to take before we start the requirements process. So first of all, you want to vet the process to make sure it's a good candidate for automation, technically speaking. With simple RPA, these are standardized, repeatable processes with structured data. Then you have more complex, intelligent automation that might include things like OCR, decision-making, or machine learning. But even in this case, you want to make sure that your platform has the proper tools and the technical capability to perform the desired function. However, it's not just the technical aspect. You also want to make sure that you vet the process from a business perspective. In hard terms, you're going to be asking, what is the ROI? In softer terms, you want to discover how this automation will improve the business process overall. So what I mean by that, you're going to be looking at things like, how will your associates be free to work on other things now that this process is being automated? You also want to consider timing. For example, are you about to spend time automating a long, involved process on a system that's going to be retired or significantly upgraded in 3 months? You just want to make sure that it makes sense. So in other words, are you getting the biggest possible bang for your buck? Now, once you know that you can and should automate the process, we need to prep ourselves for the requirements gathering process. First thing you want to do is schedule a high-level overview with the business representative. Sometimes this is going to be the person in a leadership capacity who can speak to the process at a high level. During this step, you're looking for any red flags from a business or process perspective that would question whether or not we still think it's a good candidate now that we have a little bit more detail. After you do the high-level overview, the next thing you want is to schedule a detailed overview with the process SME. This is typically an operations expert who performs this task on a regular basis, and they're intimately familiar with the ins and outs of the process. During this step, you want the SME to do a screen share with you, or if you happen to be in the same room, you can look over their shoulder And you're going to view a demo of the entire process from start to finish. This time, you're going to be looking for technical roadblocks. What I mean by that are just basically steps in the process that cannot or should not be automated because of current technical limitations or the various functionality options that you have within your own platform. As the person writing the requirements, you want to make sure that you leave this stage with a really good understanding of the process, including the steps that should be taken when you encounter an exception. What I mean by that, when I say exception, is basically just the system doesn't behave as expected, or you have defined alternate routes that you want the process to take when we don't get desired results from the system. Now, it's a good idea to record this demo so you can reference it later. That's going to help when you're estimating your individual effort for creating the requirements, or on a wider scale, it can help build a proposal or a business case for the automation of this process.
All right, great. So what makes a good requirements document for automation?
So a good requirements document is going to be composed of several different elements. It's always a good idea to start with a business overview that describes in layman's terms what the process will do and who it's for. So this is an opportunity for you to explain the intent of the process and then also outline which department or business area this is going to. Next, you should create a high-level overview of the process. I personally like to use a flowchart form in order to provide a simplified and visual depiction of the process flow. Now, the heart of the document is the low-level process steps. This is a literal step-by-step, click-by-click instruction set for how to run the process from start to finish. There are a few things we should keep in mind when we're documenting the low-level process steps. So first of all, I like to say, pretend like you're explaining to a 5-year-old how to do this process. You need to capture all of the decision points, every single click, every single step, everything you're going to do, as if the person doesn't know anything at all about the system or the process. That's the kind of detail we're talking about here. You also want to make sure that if a decision needs to be made, you capture that in your document using an if-then-else format. So if you encounter this scenario, then take this action. Otherwise, do this thing. That way, the digital worker knows what to do in every circumstance. Don't forget to include a catch-all, basically a safety net if all else fails. Give the digital worker an instruction on how to recover from that. It's like a safety to prevent the process from a crash and burn. Finally, don't forget to document any aspects of the more advanced objectives that may involve some type of artificial intelligence. So, for example, if your automation is reading an OCR document, include an image of that document with all of the relevant fields highlighted and defined so they can be properly mapped. If you're using natural language processing, make sure that your requirements outline the appropriate intents and utterances. So those are the kinds of things to keep in mind. You will also want to include details such as file layouts and locations. Some processes will have an input file to trigger the process. Some will have output files as a result of completing the process. Many will have both. So consider and document things like, where will we be storing the files? How will they be delivered? It's also important to remember to capture operational specifications, such as runtime, frequency, and priority. You should also document triggers, whether this job will be scheduled to run automatically or ad hoc, and what's required to be present or to have happened elsewhere, maybe, prior to running the job. For example, does another system first need to generate a report or a file that feeds into the process you're automating? Do we need to check for a certain time of day before we run the job? Those are the things that you want to consider.
All right. So what are some techniques that help with capturing this level of detail? How is it done?
Okay, so fair warning, gathering requirements for automation is a long and tedious undertaking. As I mentioned, you want to make sure that you capture every single element of this process in detailed fashion. I feel the best thing to do is to record your requirements gathering session so that you can play it back for yourself later. During the session with the SME, Just focus on making sure that you understand the process in full and that you ask clarifying questions to uncover any anomalies or special instructions pertaining to the flow. Start from the beginning of the process with the login screen. So the very beginning. Have the person show you how to log in and everything that they do beyond that point. Make sure that you don't skip the how-to for any of the steps. Always keep asking, and how do you do that? And how did you do this? Confirm things like where to find the application icon or the shortcuts. Confirm whether the action taken was a double click or a single click. Whether the screen that you're looking at will always look the same, or if some of the components are built dynamically and therefore may look different between records. Also, make sure you know and define the parameters for looping through the process in case you have multiple records. Clarify what marks the end of the process and how to exit gracefully. Be sure to challenge your SME anytime they say always or never. The automation needs to know what to do in even the most unlikely scenarios because Murphy's Law, right? Right. When you're satisfied that you can do this process yourself if someone asks you to, you can now go back and begin documenting what you've learned. Review your recording and transfer the required steps to a written artifact. As a reminder, you're doing this at a click level detail. So ideally, someone who has no familiarity with your systems or with the process can follow along with this document and successfully complete the process flow from start to finish. I also recommend that you use a requirements template that contains all of these elements we've spoken about. Or if your company doesn't already have one, create one. That way your requirements documents are standardized across the organization. This helps with adoption and proliferation of best practice. It also makes historical documents more familiar and therefore easier to digest when you need to visit requirements for whatever reason. And trust me, you will need to revisit your requirements from time to time. And just so you know, there are already tools out there that can help with automating part of this requirements building process, but that is a different topic. Could probably be its own podcast.
And I was actually going to ask where, if people are just getting started, are there any places they can go to get, like you said, if they need to create a template and they can use it over and over, do we have anything that they can kind of base that on? Or
these days, most companies probably do already have a template that they would like for their associates to use. However, in case you are working somewhere that doesn't have this established already and you have an opportunity to create something new, I would recommend checking out the International Institute of Business Analysis. That's an organization that contains very valuable resources for people interested in business analysis, including resources, professional development opportunities, education and training, events that you can attend, and you could become a member. So that would be a good starting point across the board for anybody who just doesn't have any clue where to begin.
Okay, perfect. That's super helpful. And we'll include a link to that in the show notes for anybody that's interested. Great. So what are some ways to verify the requirements document is accurate and comprehensive?
Simply put, you need to review the requirements you have created with the owners of the process. So that's going to be the SME that you were working with prior, the operations expert that we spoke about earlier. You just want to make sure that the person who owns that process approves of the requirements that you've written. The way to do that, first off, is to just do a document review. Literally get together with the SME and go over that document that you just wrote, reading it out loud, line by line, and seek verbal approval on the steps that you captured. If that goes well, the second step is what we call a walkthrough. Here, you're going to log into the machine and physically perform the steps as outlined in the requirements document. You're going to do that in the application, and you're going to do it real time. That's the best indicator of whether or not you've truly captured all the required steps and accounted for the typical variations in the process flow. You would be surprised how many times you will get up to this point and still find that you've got an important action or a step that has somehow been left out.
It reminds me of the peanut butter and jelly sandwich example from English class. Did you have that?
Where you have to give someone instructions on how to build the sandwich.
And the teacher ends up putting the jar of peanut butter on the loaf of bread.
Exactly. And that is how you need to think, especially when you're writing requirements for an automated process, because you need to capture every step.
Oh, school does pay off.
Yes, it does.
I have to remember that when my 12-year-old is questioning.
Absolutely. And then once you've successfully completed the walkthrough, now is a good time to get written sign off. And if you could see me now, I'm winking.
I can confirm she did wink. All right. So what are some things to avoid when building requirements?
Don't wing it. Follow a routine discovery and documentation process. And as I mentioned before, use templates so that you're standardizing your artifacts. Don't cut corners, don't skip steps, and certainly don't make assumptions that some things about the process are common knowledge. Keep in mind that the digital worker is a clean slate and has to be told every little thing about the process you're building. So if you are in doubt, go ahead and add the instruction to the document anyway. You'll be better off. Don't rush, take your time. Go into this knowing that it's a pretty arduous process. It's very tedious. It takes a long time. So you just want to make sure that you're being careful with it. It is very rewarding when it's done correctly, though, because in the end, your automation will be accurate as a result of strong requirements. But perhaps most importantly, don't make the assumption that a requirements document is unnecessary. In many cases, you might find that the process SME and the person building the automation are one and the same. And sure, that's convenient, but what happens when that person has moved on to the next stage in their career and the rest of the team is left trying to figure out what this undocumented automation is supposed to be doing? For both modifications and break fixes, it's critical to know what the process was originally meant to do and how it's supposed to do it. That's where a good set of requirements can truly shine.
Awesome. Well, this has been great, Khatina. Thank you so much. I hope this was helpful for our audience who's listening. Now, if anybody has questions or would like to connect with you, what's the best way for them to find you?
They can easily find me on LinkedIn. And I'll just go ahead and spell. My first name is Khatina, Khatina. Last name is Brunson, B like boy, Runson.
Okay, perfect. And we'll put a link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes as well.
Wonderful.
Perfect. Well, great. Thank you so much, Khatina, for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was definitely a pleasure. And I would also like to thank all of the listeners for tuning in.
And I would as well. So thank you, audience, so much for your time today. We hope you enjoyed hearing from Customer Success Manager Khatina Brunson. And we hope that you learned some useful tips about planning your requirements. We hope everyone has a wonderful day, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you again.
You've been listening to Generation Digital Workforce. If you want to hear more about RPA, AI, and other cognitive technologies that are shaping the future of work, join us next time as we continue to go deeper on these topics with industry innovators and experts. To make sure you never miss a future episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. And if you've liked what you heard today, please leave us a review. It's one of the best ways to help more people find valuable content. For show notes and more info, visit us at blueprism.com/podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.